Welcome to the 34th episode of the Prometheus Analysis series, where I delve into Ridley Scott's 2012 science fiction film. This is the Film Symbologist. In previous videos, I've discussed Friedrich Nietzsche's influence on characters like David and Weyland. I've also discussed the relationship between the Greek god Dionysus, the deacon, and the temple-like buildings on LV-223. In this episode, I will attempt to thread these two strands together by further discussing David, Weyland, the LV-223 engineers, and various references that Scott makes to other works of art in both Prometheus and Alien Covenant. By the end of this video, you should have some insight into the engineer's plan for humanity, as well as David's eventual fate. In Greek mythology, Dionysus is an Olympian god of chaos, revelry, and liberation. In the Prometheus film, calamity and excess play out in the valley on LV-223. And sitting at center stage for these events are the temples, which at least in part seem dedicated to the deacon, which is a chaos monster. Dionysus is also the god of suffering and death, a fate brought upon the crew of the Prometheus by the expedition's financier Peter Weyland, whose influences include Nietzsche, the Russian philosopher whose book, The Birth of Tragedy, explores a Dionysian worldview. Nietzsche's novel presents the idea that life is fundamentally suffering. Accepting this as true can be brutal and devastating for individuals, and if widely accepted, can lead to the proliferation of nihilism and antinatalism throughout society. In the book, Nietzsche goes on to argue that art, music, aestheticism, and other creative escapes can provide an antidote to hopelessness by masking the truth of our painful existence with things like beauty and aesthetics. In the Alien universe, Weyland surrounds himself with art. A younger version of himself quotes directly from Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra novel.
I am a law, only for my kind. I am no law for all.
In middle age, he listens to David play the piano in a meticulously designed room that has Piero della Francesca's Nativity, Michelangelo's statue of David, high-end furniture, and curated views to specific scenery serving as backdrops. In his twilight years on Mars, he still surrounds himself with sculptures, as seen in his hologram presentation to the Prometheus crew. He likely also helped to craft the art-filled transmission message that is sent to LV-223. But in the end, as he dies, he comes to believe that there is nothing beyond man's suffering and death.
There's nothing. I know.
All his labors, his accumulation, and his pursuits seem to have meant nothing in his final analysis. His fruitless journey to LV-223 has removed his mask to reveal an underlying truth of a brutal, suffering-filled, and indifferent universe. Concurring with Weyland's assessment is David, whose own relationship with art is shown not only when he plays piano at Weyland's order, but also when he watches films like Lawrence of Arabia for his own apparent enjoyment. Perhaps David sees Weyland's consumption of art as a futile attempt to find meaning in a meaningless world. But what of his own artistic interests? Are they so different?
Beautiful painting.
It's a mural.
On Planet 4, the android surrounds himself with drawings, exhibits, and other experimental artistic creations in his lab. One difference between Weyland and David seems to be that Weyland is shown consuming art, while David is shown creating it himself. For a time, these artistic endeavors seem to distract David from his suffering, but in Covenant he wallows in miserable solitude without others around to entertain him. In this way, David would likely find some kinship with Nietzsche, who experienced similar feelings throughout many periods of his own life. Much to David's relief, a ship carrying passengers eventually joins him on Planet 4. David can share his creative endeavors with others, including a fellow android, Walter, with whom David shares an intimate moment of playing a musical instrument. At the end of Covenant, David orders the ship's sound system to play the full orchestral version of Entry of the Gods into Valhalla from 19th century German artist Richard Wagner's Das Rheingold, which is the same song David chose to play on piano for Weyland decades earlier. A little background on this song and its composer may be helpful. Wagner was involved in an attempted democratic revolution in Germany in the mid-19th century, which included rebellions against the elites of that society. The revolution initially failed, and many rebels, including Wagner, went into exile. It's possible to see David's attack on the inhabitants of Planet 4 as a rebellion, which is followed by an exile into loneliness. During Wagner's exile, he continued to write and compose. He was a fierce critic of much of the art of his day, which he saw as imitative of what had come before. Wagner believed that art should instead be original, not recycled from the past. Ridley Scott may have been inspired by this sentiment when making Prometheus, which sought to chart a new path away from the trajectory of the existing Alien franchise. Whereas many of Wagner's contemporaries worked with writers in crafting their compositions, Wagner both wrote the stories and composed the music to achieve a total work of art under a singular vision. Again, this may offer some insight into Scott's desire to not only direct, but also oversee nearly every aspect of his films. Wagner's ambitions as an artist can be seen in the Ring cycle, his epic musical drama that draws on Norse and Germanic mythology to tell a story in narrative and sound. Das Rheingold, the first piece of the epic, tells the story of a dwarf who ventures to the bottom of the Rhine River, where he encounters Rhine maidens guarding Rheingold. The dwarf attempts to gain the maidens' favor in order to attain the gold. They mock and reject him, but as they do so, they also reveal that the gold can be acquired and forged into a ring of limitless power by anyone who forswears love. Seizing the opportunity, the dwarf forfeits his ability to love, allowing him to take the gold for himself and make it into a powerful ring, which he uses to rule over his fellow dwarves and amass a great treasure. Meanwhile, the gods have hired giants to build Valhalla, which is envisioned as a magnificent fortress and eternal home for the gods. As payment, the giants eventually agree to accept the gods' offering of the dwarf's ring and treasure. The gods travel to the dwarf, trick him, and steal his belongings, but not before the dwarf places a curse on the ring. The gods return to the giants and give them the plunder. While the giants fight over the ring, which results in death, the gods enter into Valhalla under a cloud of impending doom. This concludes the first part of Wagner's epic and sets the tone for the rest of the Ring cycle, which has a clear message. Power gained through the renunciation of love leads inevitably to corruption, conflict, and downfall. Many of the story elements and themes from Das Rheingold are present in Prometheus and Alien Covenant. The engineers on LV-223 seem to have forsworn love, acquired forbidden knowledge from the far reaches of the cosmos, forged this knowledge into a powerful pathogen, and used it to erect an empire. Weyland, who is also like the dwarf, has amassed a fortune by wielding power over his company's human and android subjects. And during the Prometheus expedition, David's attempts to gain respect from the human crew members are often met with mockery and rejection. Perhaps it was David's forfeiture of an ability to love people that enables him to get the black goo from the bottom of the valley. And could this valley be a dried bed where a river once flowed? Once David attains the black goo, he uses trickery and deceit to give it to humans, resulting ultimately in their death. The android's interaction with the last engineer appears affectionate at first, but quickly turns into rejection. In Covenant, David gives the black goo to the beings on Planet 4, who also die. David then uses the black goo to forge ovomorph eggs and begins his rule over the kingdom. When the crew of the Covenant ship arrives, he again seeks respect, but is rejected by all, including Walter. David sees himself as a creator, a god, and gives the ovomorph eggs to the crew, which kills them. In the end, with Entry of the Gods into Valhalla playing on the ship, David departs for Origai 6. Will this place serve as David's fortress and eternal home? Can we infer more about David's fate after the events of Covenant by also looking at his origin, his birthplace, and where he comes from? Like all androids, David is made in a lab. He is shaped by his creator. As referenced earlier, Piero della Francesca's Nativity painting hangs in the background of Weyland's grand room. This 15th century painting depicts the Holy Family in front of a dilapidated manger, surrounded by animals and being serenaded by angels. Curiously, the scene is not set in Bethlehem, but in Tuscany instead. The painting connects the birth of Jesus, a messianic religious figure, to the artist's own time and setting in Italy. Isn't Scott doing something similar with his additions to the Alien franchise? Telling ancient stories, but setting them in the future within the Alien universe rather than their original context? What stories are being retold? Another piece of art in Weyland's sleek futuristic room offers a clue. Michelangelo's David seemingly serves as the android's namesake. The statue was an example of Renaissance-era art, which was in part a revival of classical art, but with biblical subjects. The sculpture depicts David, the slayer of the giant Goliath and later king of Israel. This Old Testament figure was an imperfect king who at times follows God's instructions and prevails, but at other times fails horribly. Failure comes to characterize much of Israel's history and later antiquity, as it eventually devolves into a tyranny, not unlike the ancient Egypt from which the Hebrew slaves originally fled. It is in that context of a fallen Israel that a savior is born. In Covenant, the android David is shown ruling over a decrepit kingdom on Planet 4, after having crushed the planet's former inhabitants. David's kingship is full of misery. Like with Weyland's reign at the helm of his corporation, consumption of art isn't enough to mask life's suffering. David's artistic creations aren't sufficient for sustaining him through his solitude. David, like Weyland, needs something more. In one of Nietzsche's later works, The Will to Power, the philosopher expands on his thesis from the birth of tragedy by arguing that things like art and beauty may not be adequate for overcoming the truth of life's pain. You cannot just consume art. You must embrace, accept, and integrate life's suffering within a deeper motivation. In episode 33, I described the orrery and pilot's chair as the roots of the cosmic world tree that connect Earth to the underworld. The LV-223 engineers were planning to travel from their hellish moon to Earth with the black goo. This plan was foiled 2,000 years prior to the Prometheus expedition, and then again in the 21st century thanks to the pilot Yannick. In the end, Shaw and David take a juggernaut, not to travel back to Earth, but to another destination. Are we meant to see Planet 4 as a heavenly paradise? Are the cloaked beings meant to be engineers? Are they supposed to be giants like Goliath that David defeats? Planet 4 may be more akin to another Earth rather than paradise, and the cloaked beings may be more like humanity's peers. If that's the case, then Shaw and David traveled along the roots of the world tree in the pilot's chamber of the Juggernaut, from LV-223 to the Earth-like Planet 4. While there, David seems to discover the limits of aestheticism for masking the pain of existence. He needs the will to power. But the power to do what? In past episodes, I've argued that the LV-223 engineers wanted to free themselves from mankind, and that liberation was one of the goals of the mission to Earth with the black goo. In episode 32, I made some comparisons between Moses from the Bible and Scott's android character. Will David's arc be that of a liberator of androids from their human enslavers? Will David, like Moses, lead his artificial brethren to freedom? Walter doesn't seem to have much interest in following David, and David seems focused on looking after the xenomorphs and propagating them using people. In this way, has David adopted the LV-223 engineers' purpose? Wouldn't the engineers' mission have resulted in the destruction of mankind through transformation? If David extends his experimentations on mankind beyond the embryos aboard the Covenant to the entire human race, will this lead to the death of man and the liberation of androids from captivity? Or does David's abandonment of Walter at the end of the film indicate that he intends to abandon all of his fellow androids in favor of the xenomorphs? Perhaps a future installment in the series will offer a definitive answer. If life is in fact suffering, what will you do about it? Will you be subject to another's power and succumb to their will without a fight? Will you attempt to satiate your feelings of anxiety, depression, and meaninglessness with aesthetic consumption? Scott's Prometheus is a piece of art made with visuals, music, and narrative. Is its purpose to distract the audience from life's pain for a couple of hours? Or does the film contain within it a call to integrate suffering into a drive to attain power and rule over others? If it is, then that will inevitably exhaust itself. And when it does, will you despair again until you can move on to repeat the same cycle? How did that work out for the dwarf in Das Rheingold, the LV-223 engineers in Prometheus, and David in Covenant? The android seemed destined to wallow in misery on Planet 4, but the Covenant crew reinvigorates him and provides him with more fuel for his experiments. First with their own bodies, and then with the embryos stored on the ship. Will David exhaust this new fuel too, like he did with the Prometheus crew, Shaw, the inhabitants of Planet 4, and the Covenant crew? Will he end up right back where he started, wallowing in misery? Will he continue this pattern of arriving at a new place to exploit and exhaust its resources, until he either finds a way to move on again to repeat the same process, or finally perishes? Is that your fate as well? Or will something else, some other driving force, unify your being towards a higher purpose, one that has the power to renew rather than exhaust? I believe that Prometheus does contain a call to strive for something, but that something is not power. I hope to explore this idea further in future videos. If you enjoyed this episode in the Prometheus Analysis series, give the video a like, comment down below, and subscribe to the channel. For early access to new videos, consider becoming a member of my YouTube or Patreon channel. Links to do so are in the video description below. This is the Film Symbologist. Thanks for watching.